I've been diving for 20 years, and I thought I'd seen everything the Pacific had to offer. Coral gardens in Fiji, underwater lava tubes in Hawaii, cenotes in Mexico. I've logged over 4.0 dives across the Pacific Rim. But what I found 3 weeks ago in an unexplored cave system off the Big Island has shattered everything I believed about what exists beneath the waves. My name is Kai Nakamura, and I'm a professional diving instructor and cave explorer. The ocean has been my life since I could walk. My Japanese father was a commercial fisherman, my Hawaiian mother a traditional navigator who could read currents and weather patterns like most people read books. They raised me to respect the water as both provider and destroyer, teaching me that the Pacific held secrets older than human memory. My grandmother always told me the ocean was alive, that it had moods and memories stretching back to the beginning of time. She spoke of places where the water itself remembered things that happened before the islands rose from the seafloor, where ancient powers still moved in the depths beyond human understanding. I thought those were just stories, the kind of folklore that makes tourists pay extra for authentic island experiences. I was wrong. The cave system I discovered shouldn't exist according to any geological survey. More importantly, what lives inside it shouldn't exist according to everything we know about marine biology. But I've seen it with my own eyes, felt its ancient presence pressing against my consciousness like a weight that threatens to crush both my sanity and my soul. My dive shop, Pacific Depths, sits on a stretch of black sand beach where the lava met the ocean centuries ago. I built it myself after saving for 10 years, working commercial salvage dives and guiding scientific expeditions. The shop is part of me filled with equipment I've personally tested in every conceivable condition, walls covered with photographs from dives that pushed the boundaries of human underwater exploration. The morning that changed everything started like hundreds of others. I was in the shop at 5 a.m., checking gear for the day's advanced certification training when my 2 rescue dogs, Koa and Naya, began acting strangely. Both animals had come from the local shelter, scarred and skittish when I first brought them home, but they'd adapted to island life, usually sleeping peacefully through my early morning equipment routines. That morning was different. Koa, a pit bull mix with salt and pepper fur, stood at the shop's ocean-facing windows, whining softly and pawing at the glass. Naya, a smaller shepherd mix, paced between the dive equipment and the door, her usual calm demeanor replaced by nervous energy that had her constantly looking toward the water. "Easy, girl," I said, scratching behind Naya's ears. "Just another day on the water." But even as I said it, I noticed something unusual about the ocean conditions. The water was uncommonly still, with a glassy quality that reflected the pre-dawn sky like a mirror. In 20 years of diving these waters, I'd learned to read the ocean's moods through subtle visual cues. This stillness felt wrong, not peaceful, but expectant, like the water itself was waiting for something to happen. My first student of the day was Sophia Chen, a marine biology graduate student from UC San Diego who'd been working toward her technical diving certification for 6 months. Sophia was different from my usual client, serious, methodical, and genuinely passionate about understanding marine ecosystems rather than just collecting underwater selfies for social media. She arrived at 6 a.m. carrying her personal dive gear and a waterproof case containing research equipment for her thesis on bioluminescent organisms in deep-water environments. At 26, Sophia had already published papers on marine biology and spoke fluent Mandarin, English, and surprisingly good Hawaiian pidgin she'd picked up during her time on the island. "Morning, Kai," she said, noting my dog's unusual behavior. "Koa and Naya seem agitated. Ocean conditions looking rough today?" "Actually, it's too calm. Sometimes that means weather change is coming. Sometimes it means underwater activity we can't see from the surface." Sophia nodded, understanding the implications. She'd been diving with me long enough to know that unusual surface conditions often indicated more significant changes in deeper water columns. "Should we postpone today's dive?" I checked the weather forecast on my tablet, reviewing satellite data and local marine observations. Everything indicated perfect diving conditions, clear skies, minimal wind, calm seas. But my instincts, honed by years of reading water conditions, suggested something was different about today. "We'll proceed with caution," I decided. "Advanced protocols, conservative depth limits, and we abort at the first sign of changing conditions." As we loaded gear onto my boat, Pono Coelho arrived for his usual morning visit, At 73, Pono had been fishing these waters since before tourism transformed the Big Island. His weathered hands and sun-darkened skin told stories of decades spent reading ocean moods that escaped modern instruments and satellite forecasts. "Kai," Pono said, studying the unusual calm water with concerned eyes. "My grandfather used to say days like this were when the deep waters remembered old things. When currents from the bottom came up to touch the surface world. Just unusual weather patterns, Pono. Probably a high-pressure system settling over the area." But Pono shook his head, his expression grave. "You know better than that, boy. Your mother taught you to read water like family. This isn't weather, this is the ocean preparing for something." Before I could ask what he meant, Pono turned toward the stretch of coastline south of my shop. "Sophia mentioned caves near the south point yesterday. Old places that aren't on any diving maps. Places my people have avoided for generations." "Traditional fishing restrictions?" Sophia asked, genuinely interested in local marine management practices. "More than restrictions, Kapu forbidden waters. My grandfather's grandfather told stories about things that lived in the deep places, things that were here before our people arrived from across the Pacific. Intelligence that belonged to the ocean itself, not to any surface world. I'd heard similar stories throughout my childhood, folklore about ocean spirits and deep water guardians that protected sacred places from human interference. Most Pacific Islander cultures had traditions about respecting certain areas of the ocean, stories that usually contained practical wisdom about dangerous currents or unstable underwater terrain." "What kind of things?" Sophia pressed, her scientific curiosity overriding cultural sensitivity. Pono was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as if deciding whether she could handle traditional knowledge that wasn't meant for casual conversation. "Deep dwellers. Beings that built homes in the underwater places before human feet ever touched these islands. They made agreements with our ancestors' territorial boundaries that kept both peoples safe." "You're talking about undiscovered marine species," Sophia said, interpreting Pono's words through her scientific training. "I'm talking about intelligence, girl. Beings that think and plan and remember. Beings that have been watching surface dwellers for centuries, waiting to see if we could be trusted to share ocean space without destroying everything we touched." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of my other students for the day, a married couple from Seattle working on their advanced open water certification, and a local teenager whose family had been saving for months to afford professional dive training. 6 people total, which meant splitting into 2 groups for the technical diving portion of today's instruction. "Sophia," I said, making a decision that would change everything, "how about we scout that area Pono mentioned while the others practice navigation exercises in familiar territory? Advanced cave reconnaissance, just to see what's there." Sophia's eyes lit up with excitement. "Solo buddy team for advanced technical diving? I've been ready for that level of independence." As we prepared for departure, Pono approached me privately. "Kai, if you're going to explore the forbidden waters, there are protocols. Traditional approaches that show respect for whatever intelligence you might encounter. Such as, never dive alone. The deep dwellers respect partnerships that demonstrate mutual support. Bring offering something that shows you understand gift exchange as communication. And most importantly, if they choose to reveal themselves, approach with curiosity rather than fear. They judge surface dwellers by how we respond to the unknown." Pono handed me a small carved jade pendant, similar to the one my grandmother had given me but with different symbols etched into its surface. "Wear this below your regular pendant. It carries protection from my family line, recognition symbols that the deep dwellers will understand." An hour later, Sophia and I were anchored over the coordinates Pono had described, roughly 2 miles south of the regular diving sites where I conducted most of my business. The water here was 180 feet deep, well within our technical diving limits but requiring careful gas management and decompression planning. "Kai," Sophia said, studying her dive computer as we completed our equipment checks, "the water temperature readings are unusual. Surface temp is normal for this area, but the thermometer is showing warm layers at depth that don't match expected thermal profiles." She was right. Hawaiian waters typically showed predictable temperature gradients, with steady cooling as depth increased. But our instruments were detecting warm zones at 150 and 200 feet that suggested thermal activity, either underwater hot springs or geothermal vents that weren't documented in any survey data. Could indicate volcanic activity, I said, though the thermal patterns looked wrong for typical Hawaiian underwater geology. We'll monitor temperature changes during descent and abort if readings indicate dangerous conditions. Our descent began normally, following the anchor line through blue water that gradually darkened as sunlight faded with depth. At 60 feet, we encountered the first unusual marine life schools of fish species that typically inhabited much deeper waters, swimming at depths where they shouldn't survive. Kai, Sophia's voice came through our communication system, excitement clear despite the electronic distortion. Look at the species diversity. I'm seeing deep water fish at shallow depths, bioluminescent organisms in daylight conditions, and behavioral patterns that don't match established science. The fish weren't just present at unusual depths, they were exhibiting coordinated behaviors that suggested intelligence beyond normal schooling instincts. They moved in geometric formations, creating patterns that looked almost deliberate, like living symbols arranged in three-dimensional space. At 120 feet, we began encountering the thermal zones our instruments had detected. But instead of the chaotic mixing patterns typical of underwater hot springs, the warm water moved in organized currents that created distinct layers with sharp temperature boundaries. Natural phenomenon? Sophia asked, though her tone suggested she was reaching the same conclusion I was. Not like anything I've seen before. These thermal layers are too organized, too deliberately structured to be random geothermal activity. At 160 feet, we found the geological anomaly that would lead us to everything else. The seafloor in this area should have been volcanic rock and coral formations, typical of Hawaiian underwater topography. Instead, we discovered rock formations that looked far older, with sedimentary layers and mineral compositions that didn't match the surrounding geology. Kai, this doesn't belong here. These rock formations predate the volcanic activity that created the Big Island. This is geological impossible unless... Unless what? Unless this section of seafloor is much older than the island itself. A remnant of ancient geological structures that somehow survived the volcanic processes that formed everything else in this area. The implications were staggering. If Sophia was correct, we were looking at evidence of geological processes that predated everything science understood about Pacific Island formation. But more immediately important was what the ancient geology contained. At 180 feet, we found the cave entrance. It was larger than any natural cave formation I'd seen in Hawaiian waters, roughly 20 feet wide and 15 feet tall, carved into the ancient rock face with precision that immediately struck me as artificial. Natural caves formed by water erosion showed irregular, organic patterns. This entrance displayed geometric proportions and structural engineering that suggested deliberate construction. Someone built this, Sophia said, running her lights along the entrance walls to document the construction details. This is artificial modification of natural rock formations, possibly complete artificial construction disguised to look natural. The entrance walls showed tool marks that were barely visible but definitely present parallel grooves and cutting patterns that indicated advanced construction techniques. More unsettling were the symbols carved into the rock around the entrance. They weren't recognizable as any human writing system, but they clearly represented intentional communication, warnings, or instructions left by whoever had created this underwater structure. Age estimate? I asked, though I suspected the answer would be difficult to accept. Based on mineral deposits and erosion patterns, these modifications are thousands of years old, possibly tens of thousands. This construction predates any known human presence in the Pacific. We followed standard cave diving protocols, setting up a guideline system that would ensure we could find our way back to the entrance, even in zero visibility conditions. The cave interior extended beyond our light's penetration, sloping downward at a gentle angle that suggested significant depth ahead. The water inside the cave was different from the surrounding ocean. Instead of the normal blue-green tint of Hawaiian waters, it had an unusual clarity that made our lights seem more penetrating than they should at this depth. More unsettling was the temperature several degrees warmer than the surrounding ocean, with thermal gradients that suggested deliberate environmental control rather than natural processes. Hydrothermal vents? Sophia suggested when I mentioned the temperature patterns. Maybe, but the thermal control is too precise. Natural vent systems create hotspots and chaotic mixing. This feels like environmental engineering. As we proceeded deeper into the cave system, following safety protocols that required constant communication and position monitoring, the architectural details became more elaborate and obviously artificial. The walls showed construction techniques that integrated natural rock formations with artificial elements in ways that created structures both beautiful and unsettling. "Kai," Sophia said as we approached 220 feet depth and 300 feet penetration into the cave system, "the construction is becoming more complex. These aren't simple modifications of natural cave. This is sophisticated architecture built for specific purposes." The cave widened into the first major chamber, and what we found there challenged everything we thought we understood about underwater construction and ancient Pacific history. "Kai," she said as we suited up on my boat that morning, "Pono mentioned something about caves near the south point that aren't on any diving maps. Local taboo areas." Pono was an elderly Hawaiian fisherman who'd been working these waters since before I was born. He spent most evenings at my dive shop, sharing stories about the old days when fishing was governed by spiritual protocols that modern islanders had forgotten. Most of his tales involved warnings about places where divers shouldn't go, waters that held dangers beyond drowning or equipment failure. "Pono tells a lot of stories," I said, checking our gas mixtures for the third time. "Most of them designed to keep tourists from getting into trouble in areas they're not qualified to handle. But some of his warnings have proven accurate," Sophia pointed out. "That current system near Kealakekua that he said would trap divers you confirmed that with your depth measurements." She was right. Pono's knowledge of local water conditions was uncanny, based on observations accumulated over decades of fishing and diving. His warnings usually had practical foundations, even when wrapped in traditional folklore. What exactly did he say about these caves? That they're older than the island itself. That they connect to something that was here before the volcanoes rose from the ocean floor. Sophia secured her regulator and tested her buoyancy compensator. He also said his grandfather told him never to dive there after sunset and never alone. The location Pono had described was roughly 2 miles south of our usual diving sites, in an area where the underwater topography created complex current patterns that kept most recreational divers away. I'd never explored it thoroughly, partly because my business focused on accessible sites suitable for tourists and certification training. "Advanced technical dive only," I said, making the decision that would change everything. "Full cave protocols, limited penetration, and we turn around at the first sign of anything unusual." 45 minutes later, we anchored over a section of the sea floor that looked unremarkable on sonar. The depth here was 180 feet, well within our technical diving limits but deep enough to require careful gas management and decompression planning. The water was unusually clear, with visibility extending beyond our light's maximum range. As we descended, I noticed something that didn't match the surrounding geology. While most of the seafloor in this area consisted of volcanic rock and coral formations typical of Hawaiian waters, this section showed signs of much older geological processes. The rock formations looked weathered by timescales that predated the volcanic activity that created the Big Island. "Kai," Sophia's voice crackled through our communication system. "Look at the rock striations. These don't match the volcanic patterns we see everywhere else around the island." She was right. The rock face we were approaching showed sedimentary layers that suggested much older origins, as if this section of seafloor was a remnant of ancient geological structures that had been preserved despite the volcanic activity that formed the rest of the island. At 190 feet, we found the cave entrance. It was larger than I'd expected, roughly 20 feet wide and 15 feet tall, carved into the cliff face with smooth precision that immediately struck me as unnatural. Cave systems formed by water erosion typically showed irregular organic patterns. This entrance looked deliberately constructed, with geometric proportions that seemed too perfect to be accidental. "Natural formation?" Sophia asked, running her lights along the entrance walls. "Unlikely." I studied the construction more carefully, noting tool marks that were barely visible but definitely present. This shows signs of artificial modification, maybe even complete construction. We followed standard cave diving protocols, setting up a guideline system that would ensure we could find our way back to the entrance, even in zero visibility conditions. The cave interior extended beyond our light's penetration, sloping downward at a gentle angle that suggested significant depth ahead. The water inside the cave was different from the surrounding ocean. Instead of the normal blue-green tint of Hawaiian waters, it had an unusual clarity that made our lights seem more penetrating than they should at this depth. More unsettling was the temperature several degrees warmer than the surrounding ocean, suggesting thermal activity deeper in the system. Hydrothermal vents? Sophia suggested when I mentioned the temperature difference. Maybe, but the thermal gradient is too uniform. Usually vent activity creates hotspots and mixing zones. We proceeded slowly, following the cave's main passage as it curved and descended. At 220 feet depth, roughly 300 feet into the cave system, we encountered the first chamber. The chamber was enormously 100 feet across and 50 feet tall, with walls that showed the same artificial construction techniques as the entrance. But what made me question my sanity were the structures inside the chamber. They weren't natural formations. They weren't recognizable as human construction either. Instead, the chamber contained what could only be described as architectural elements that followed no design principles I'd ever encountered. Curved walls that seemed to flow into each other without visible joints. Support structures that appeared to grow organically from the chamber floor. And throughout it all, a sense of deliberate organization that suggested intelligence behind the construction. Kai. Sophia's voice was tight with excitement and confusion. This is impossible. These structures predate human presence in the Pacific by thousands of years. I was thinking the same thing, but the implications were too large to accept easily. Could be natural mineral formations, unusual crystallization patterns. Look at the symmetry. Look at the deliberate spacing between elements. This is architecture, Kai, designed and built by intelligence. As we moved deeper into the chamber, our lights began revealing details that made the situation even more unsettling. The walls were covered with cymbal snot carved into the rock, but somehow formed as part of the original construction. The symbols were complex geometric patterns that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles, creating optical illusions that made my eyes hurt to follow. More disturbing were the acoustic properties. Every sound we made breathing, equipment noise, the bubbles from our regulator echoed through the chamber with harmonic distortions that created almost musical patterns. It was as if the chamber itself was designed to modify and enhance sound in specific ways. Someone built this, Sophia said, her voice carrying clearly despite our depth. The question is who and when. We documented everything we could with underwater cameras, but the photographs couldn't capture the sense of presence that filled the chamber. It felt occupied, even though we could see no signs of current habitation. The architecture itself seemed to watch us, to evaluate our intrusion into spaces that had been undisturbed for unknown periods of time. The chamber was enormously 100 feet across and 50 feet tall, with walls that showed the same artificial construction techniques as the entrance but on a scale that defied rational explanation. The engineering required to create such a space at these depths, with structural integrity sufficient to withstand crushing water pressure, was beyond anything that should have been possible using pre-industrial technology. But what made me question my sanity were the structures inside the chamber. They weren't natural formations. They weren't recognizable as human construction either. Instead, the chamber contained what could only be described as architectural elements that followed design principles completely alien to anything in human experience. Curved walls that seemed to flow into each other without visible joints. Support structures that appeared to grow organically from the chamber floor while maintaining geometric precision. And throughout it all, a sense of deliberate organization that suggested intelligence behind every detail. Kai. Sophia's voice was tight with excitement and growing fear. This is impossible. These structures predate human presence in the Pacific by thousands of years, but they show technological sophistication that shouldn't exist in any pre-industrial civilization. I was thinking the same thing, but the implications were too large to accept easily. Could be natural mineral formations, unusual crystallization patterns caused by unique water chemistry or geological processes. Look at the symmetry. Look at the deliberate spacing between elements. This is architecture, Kai, designed and built by intelligence that understood advanced engineering principles. As we moved deeper into the chamber, our lights began revealing details that made the situation even more unsettling. The walls were covered with cymbal snot carved into the rock, but somehow formed as part of the original construction. The symbols were complex geometric patterns that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles, creating optical illusions that made my eyes hurt to follow their movements. More disturbing were the acoustic properties. Every sound we made breathing, equipment noise, the bubbles from our regulator echoed through the chamber with harmonic distortions that created almost musical patterns. It was as if the chamber itself was designed to modify and enhance sound in specific ways, like a massive underwater instrument built for purposes we couldn't comprehend. "Someone built this," Sophia said, her voice carrying clearly despite our depth and the electronic distortion of our communication system. "The question is who, when, and why they needed such sophisticated acoustic engineering underwater. We documented everything we could with underwater cameras, but the photographs couldn't capture the sense of presence that filled the chamber. It felt occupied, even though we could see no signs of current habitation. The architecture itself seemed to watch us, to evaluate our intrusion into spaces that had been undisturbed for unknown periods of time. As we explored the chamber's perimeter, I noticed that the symbols on the walls weren't static decorations. They appeared to be functional elements of the architecture, with patterns that changed in response to our presence. When we approached certain areas, symbols would brighten or shift configuration, as if our proximity activated some kind of sensing system built into the walls themselves. "Kai, you need to see this," Sophia called from the chamber's far end, where the wall curved into what appeared to be an alcove or specialized workspace. The area she'd discovered contained what could only be described as control panel surfaces, covered with symbol arrays that glowed with faint bioluminescence when touched. But these weren't crude mechanical controls. They showed the kind of sophisticated interface design that suggested advanced understanding of user interaction and system management. "Touch, responsive symbols," Sophia said, carefully placing her gloved hand against one of the panels. The symbols change configuration based on contact pressure and duration. "This is user interface technology. Technology that's thousands of years old and somehow still functional underwater at crushing depth," I added, watching the symbols shift and brighten in response to her touch, which suggests either incredibly advanced materials science or some kind of self-maintaining system that can operate without external power sources for extended periods. At the far end of the chamber, we found another passage leading deeper into the cave system. This passage was smaller, more tunnel-like, but it showed the same construction techniques and symbolic markings. Against my better judgment, curiosity, and professional obligation to document the discovery convinced me we should continue our exploration. "Gas management check," I said, reviewing our breathing mixture levels and decompression requirements. "We have time for limited additional penetration, but we need to maintain conservative safety margins." "Agreed. 15 minutes maximum. Then we begin exit procedures regardless of what we find." The passage descended more steeply, taking us to depths approaching our technical limits. At 260 feet, we reached a second chamber that was even more elaborate than the first. This one contained what could only be described as machinery devices built from materials I couldn't identify, with moving parts that operated despite being submerged at crushing depth for unknown periods of time. "Kai, this is functioning technology," Sophia said, approaching one of the devices with scientific fascination and growing alarm. "These machines are operating underwater, at depth, apparently without any external power source." The machinery was unlike anything in human engineering experience. Instead of recognizable mechanical components like gears, pistons, or electronic circuits, these devices seemed to operate on principles that combined biological and mechanical elements in ways that shouldn't be possible. Organic-looking materials that moved with mechanical precision, crystalline structures that pulsed with internal light, fluid systems that flowed in patterns too complex to be simple hydraulics. "Biomechanical integration," Sophia said, documenting the devices with her underwater cameras. "These machines use biological components as functional elements in mechanical systems. It's technology that bridges the gap between living organisms and artificial devices." As we studied the machinery, something began happening throughout the chamber. Devices that had appeared dormant started activating, with mechanical sounds that carried clearly through the water. Equipment that had seemed purely decorative began moving, rotating, and producing harmonic vibrations that I could feel in my chest cavity. "We triggered something," I said, every instinct I'd developed in 20 years of diving screaming warnings. Our presence activated some kind of automatic system. The chamber was coming alive around us, with technology that responded to human presence in ways that suggested deliberate programming. But programming by whom, and for what purpose? Before we could analyze the situation further, the chamber filled with presence. I don't know how else to describe it. Suddenly, we weren't alone in the water. Something massive was moving in the depths beyond our lights, something that had been awakened by our intrusion into its domain. The water around us began to vibrate with low-frequency sounds that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Not mechanical sounds like the activated machinery, but organic vocalizations that carried intelligence and purpose. Communication sounds that suggested we were being observed and evaluated by something that understood exactly what we were and why we were there. "Something's here," Sophia whispered, her voice barely audible above the acoustic phenomena filling the chamber. Something large, intelligent, and very much alive. Our lights caught movement in the passage leading to deeper sections of the cave system. Something was ascending from the depths, something large enough to create pressure waves that we could feel through our equipment and protective suits. As it approached, the chamber's machinery increased its activity, as if responding to the presence of whatever was coming up from below. When it entered our light range, I understood why Pono's stories had warned against diving in these waters. The entity was unlike anything in marine biology textbooks, roughly humanoid in basic structure but adapted for deep water life in ways that violated normal evolutionary patterns. Its limbs were elongated, with joints that bent in directions that human anatomy couldn't accommodate. Its torso was streamlined for underwater movement, but with proportions that suggested intelligence rather than simple aquatic adaptation. Most importantly, its head was enlarged in ways that indicated advanced cognitive development, multiple eyes arranged in patterns that provided comprehensive visual coverage, sensory organs that pulsed with bioluminescent activity, suggesting sophisticated environmental awareness, and throughout its entire form, the same biomechanical integration we'd observed in the chamber's machinery. But most disturbing was its obvious intelligence. The entity studied us with the same scientific curiosity we'd been directing toward its habitat. It moved with deliberate purpose, positioning itself to observe us from different angles, while maintaining a distance that suggested respect for our apparent fragility and unfamiliarity with its environment. "It's sapient," Sophia said, her voice filled with awe and terror. "We're looking at an intelligent species that's completely unknown to surface science." The entity began producing complex vocalizations that resonated through the chamber's acoustic design with harmonic richness that indicated sophisticated communication capabilities. The sounds were clearly structured language, with grammatical patterns and tonal variations that suggested communication complexity rivaling human speech. More importantly, the chamber's machinery was responding to these vocalizations, translating them into the visual symbols that appeared on the walls around us. The technology wasn't just functional. It was a communication interface designed to facilitate interaction between the entities and visitors to their domain. The symbols, I realized. They're a translation system. The chamber is converting its language into visual patterns that other intelligences might be able to interpret. As we watched, the wall symbols began forming recognizable concepts. Not human language, but mathematical relationships and geometric patterns that transcended species-specific communication. The entity was attempting to establish common ground for communication based on universal principles that any intelligent species would understand. It showed us star patterns, indicating knowledge of celestial navigation that matched or exceeded human astronomical understanding. It displayed mathematical progressions that demonstrated comprehension of advanced concepts including prime numbers, geometric relationships, and what appeared to be calculus-level mathematics. Most significantly, it created architectural diagrams that matched the construction we'd observed throughout the cave system. "They built this place," Sophia said, her voice filled with wonder and growing fear. "This entire cave system is artificial construction by an intelligent species that predates human civilization in the Pacific." The communication continued for nearly 20 minutes, with the entity showing remarkable patience as it attempted to establish meaningful contact with two surface dwellers who clearly lacked sophisticated understanding of its technology or communication methods. It demonstrated the chamber's various systems, explained the purpose of different architectural elements through visual diagrams, and even provided what appeared to be historical information about the construction timeline. But our gas supplies were approaching the limits for safe ascent, and the depth we were operating at required careful decompression planning that couldn't be delayed without risking serious injury or death. "We have to go," I said reluctantly, checking our dive computers and gas mixture levels. "Decompression requirements mandate immediate ascent." The entity seemed to understand our physiological limitations. It produced a series of final vocalizations that the chamber translated into symbols showing what appeared to be mathematical countdown sequences and return navigation instructions. Then it withdrew into the deeper passages, disappearing beyond our light's range, with graceful movements that suggested complete mastery of its underwater environment. Our ascent to the surface was the longest decompression sequence of my diving career. We had to make extended stops at multiple depths, giving us time to process what we'd experienced while surrounded by the normal beauty of Hawaiian marine life that suddenly seemed ordinary compared to what we'd discovered in the depths below. "Kai," Sophia said during our 20-foot safety stop, watching tropical fish swim past with behavior patterns that now seemed simple compared to the intelligence we'd encountered. "We can't report this through normal academic or government channels. This discovery is too significant for standard scientific protocols." She was absolutely right. First contact with an unknown intelligent species, evidence of advanced pre-human civilization in the Pacific, and technology that operated under principles we didn't understand. These discoveries would fundamentally alter human understanding of both marine life and planetary history. But they would also bring attention to these waters that could be dangerous for both species involved. Military interest, media sensationalism, and scientific exploitation could threaten whatever civilization existed in the deep cave systems, while exposing surface humanity to technologies and intelligence we weren't prepared to understand or interact with safely. "We need time to think about this," I said. "Time to understand what we've discovered and figure out the right way to handle contact with an intelligence that's been hidden from human knowledge for thousands of years." When we finally surfaced and returned to my dive shop, Pono was waiting for us on the dock with an expression that suggested he'd been expecting this conversation for years. The elderly fisherman took one look at our faces and nodded with understanding that indicated he knew exactly what we'd experienced in the forbidden waters. "You found them," he said simply. "The deep dwellers. My grandfather's stories were true." "How long have your people known about them?" I asked, securing our equipment while trying to process the implications of Pono's matter-of-fact acceptance of our discovery. "Since the first Polynesian navigators reached these waters over 1,000 years ago. The deep dwellers were here when we arrived, and they've remained hidden while human civilization grew on the surface. There are protocols, agreements, that have been maintained for generations." "What kind of agreements?" "Territorial respect. We don't disturb their deep places. They don't interfere with surface activities. Both species coexist without conflict, because both sides understand the benefits of maintaining boundaries." Sophia and I spent the evening listening to Pono's stories about the deep dwellers, learning about traditional knowledge that had been carefully preserved despite the overwhelming influence of modern culture on island life. The entities we'd encountered weren't an unknown discovery. They were part of an ancient relationship between surface and deep civilizations that had been maintained through mutual respect and carefully negotiated boundaries. "But those boundaries are breaking down," Pono explained, his weathered face grave with concern. "Modern diving technology allows people to reach depths that were previously inaccessible. Tourism brings people who don't understand the traditional protocols. Commercial fishing and military activities disturb areas that have been off-limits for generations. The deep dwellers are being forced to deal with surface contact more frequently." "What do they want from us?" I asked. "The same thing they've always wanted, to be left alone in their deep places. But they're intelligent, curious about surface dwellers. Some contact is acceptable if it's done with respect and understanding of the protocols that keep both species safe." As Pono described the traditional relationship between surface and deep civilizations, I began understanding why the entity had been so patient with our intrusion. We weren't the first surface dwellers to discover their domain. We were just the latest in a long history of careful contact between species that had learned to coexist through mutual respect. "The entity we met," Sophia said, "it seemed to understand that we were different from previous surface contact. It was evaluating us." "Testing you," Pono corrected. The deep dwellers judge surface people by how they respond to contact with the unknown. Fear and aggression mark someone as dangerous. Curiosity and respect mark someone as potentially trustworthy. What determines whether contact continues or stops? How you handle the knowledge, whether you try to exploit what you've learned or protect it, whether you bring others who understand the protocols or others who want to dominate and control. That night, I lay awake in my bungalow, listening to the ocean sounds that had always brought me peace but now carried implications I'd never considered. Somewhere out there, intelligence moved through deep waters that humans had assumed were empty, except for simple marine life. Technology operated that could revolutionize human understanding of engineering and biology. And most importantly, I carried responsibility for protecting both the surface world I'd always called home and the deep realm that had chosen to trust me with knowledge that could transform or destroy everything we thought we understood about our planet. To go, I said reluctantly. Gas management requires immediate assent. The entity seemed to understand our situation. It produced a series of final vocalizations that the chamber translated into symbols showing what appeared to be mathematical countdown sequences. Then it withdrew into the deeper passages, disappearing beyond our light's range. Our ascent to the surface was the longest decompression sequence of my diving career. We had to make extended stops at multiple depths, giving us time to process what we'd experienced while surrounded by the normal beauty of Hawaiian marine life that suddenly seemed ordinary compared to what we'd discovered in the depths. Kai, Sophia said during our 20-foot safety stop, we can't report this through normal channels. This discovery is too significant for standard academic or government protocols. She was right. First contact with an unknown intelligent species, evidence of advanced pre-human civilization in the Pacific, and technology that operated under principles we didn't understand. These discoveries would fundamentally alter human understanding of both marine life and planetary history. But they would also bring attention to these waters that could be dangerous for both species involved. Military interest, media attention, and scientific exploitation could threaten whatever civilization existed in the deep cave systems. When we finally surfaced and returned to my dive shop, Pono was waiting for us on the dock. The elderly fisherman took one look at our faces and nodded with understanding that suggested he'd been expecting this conversation for years. "You found them," he said simply. "The deep dwellers. My grandfather's stories were true." "How long have your people known about them?" I asked. "Since the first Polynesian navigators reached these waters. The deep dwellers were here when we arrived, and they've remained hidden while human civilization grew on the surface. There are protocols, agreements, that have been maintained for generations." "What kind of agreements?" "Territorial respect. We don't disturb their deep places. They don't interfere with surface activities. Both species coexist without conflict." Sophia and I spent the evening listening to Pono's stories about the deep dwellers, learning about traditional knowledge that had been carefully preserved despite the overwhelming influence of modern culture. The entities we'd encountered weren't an unknown discovery. They were part of an ancient relationship between surface and deep civilizations that had been maintained through respect and careful boundaries. "But those boundaries are breaking down," Pono explained. "Modern diving technology allows people to reach depths that were previously inaccessible. Tourism brings people who don't understand the traditional protocols. The deep dwellers are being disturbed more frequently." "What do they want from us?" I asked. "The same thing they've always wanted. To be left alone in their deep places. But they're intelligent, curious about surface dwellers. Some contact is acceptable if it's done with respect and understanding." Over the next week, I struggled with the implications of our discovery. I had a business to run, students to train, tourists to guide through safe diving experiences. But I also carried knowledge of an intelligent species that could revolutionize human understanding of life on Earth. The decision was made for me when 3 more divers went missing in the area where we'd found the cave system. All were experienced technical divers, attempting to explore what local diving forums were calling Nakamura's secret cave information had leaked, despite our attempts at discretion. I assembled a search team and returned to the cave system, hoping to find the missing divers before they encountered the deep dwellers without proper preparation or understanding of the protocols Pono had described. We found them in the first chamber, alive but changed. They were conscious and responsive, but their behavior showed signs of prolonged exposure to the chamber's acoustic and visual phenomena. They claim to have been communicating with the entities for days, learning about deep water civilization and advanced concepts that human science hadn't yet discovered. They're not hostile, one of the missing divers told me as we prepared for emergency ascent. But they're concerned about increasing surface intrusion into their territory. They want to establish formal communication protocols. Through whom? Through you, Kai. They recognize your respect for ocean protocols and traditional knowledge. You've been chosen as a liaison. The implications of that statement terrified me more than any diving emergency I'd ever faced. Becoming a liaison between human and deep-dweller civilizations was far beyond my qualifications or authority. But the alternative uncontrolled contact between species with vastly different capabilities and motivations could be catastrophic for both sides. 2 weeks later, I made the most difficult decision of my diving career. I sealed the cave entrance using controlled explosions that collapsed the tunnel system while preserving the deeper chambers. The deep dwellers had agreed to this temporary solution, understanding that uncontrolled surface access posed dangers to both species. But the seal is temporary. The entities have technology and capabilities that could easily reopen the passages when they choose to do so. They're giving human civilization time to develop protocols and wisdom sufficient for formal contact, but that patience isn't unlimited. I still run my dive shop, still train students, and guide tourist expeditions. But everything has changed. I know that intelligence exists in the deep places, that ancient civilizations predate human presence in the Pacific, and that contact between surface and deep cultures is inevitable. The question isn't whether formal contact will occur, but whether humanity will be ready for the responsibilities that come with communication between species. Based on what I've learned from the deep dwellers, we're being evaluated just as carefully as we evaluated them during our first encounter. And the test results will determine whether future contact leads to beneficial exchange between civilizations, or whether the deep dwellers decide that surface humanity poses too great a threat to tolerate in shared ocean spaces. I check the sealed cave entrance every month, looking for signs that the deep dwellers have chosen to reopen communication channels. Each dive down to the seal feels like approaching a doorway between worlds, knowing that someday it will open again and change everything we think we know about life on Earth. Pono says his grandfather's stories mentioned other cave systems, other deep dweller communities throughout the Pacific. If that's true, then what I discovered near the Big Island is just one small part of a much larger civilization that spans the ocean depths. The ocean my grandmother taught me to respect as a living entity turns out to be even more alive than she knew. And now I carry the responsibility of protecting both the surface world I've always called home and the deep realm that has chosen to trust me with knowledge that could transform or destroy everything we think we understand about our planet. Some days I wish I'd listened more carefully to Pono's warnings about forbidden waters, but most days I feel honored to have been chosen as a bridge between worlds, even if that honor comes with weight that sometimes threatens to crush my ability to function in the normal surface world, where most people have no idea what intelligence watches them from the depths below.